Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Sigurd Westberg was a Swedish-American historian and archivist with a shock of long white hair falling down from his balding head and an equally white beard that hung below eyes that shone and sparkled with grandfatherly kindness. As Sig was strolling home one day, he met a young girl coming toward him along the sidewalk. And as this girl got close to him, she stopped and her eyes got wide. And she looked up at him and she said, "Are you God?" I'm not sure which of them was more surprised, Sig for being asked, or the young girl for believing she had seen the Divine One on a Chicago sidewalk. If you watched the Olympics over the last 2 weeks, you saw and heard a lot of testimonials to the importance of seeing. Because it's not just the archers and the shooters who need to see really clearly. The gymnasts and the divers, too, talk about the importance of being able to see their landing, to see the spot where they will end their routine or enter the water, so that they can finish off their tricky maneuvers properly. Even if they don't suffer from the now notorious twisties, if they can't spot their landing, they risk getting lost in the air and splatting onto the mat or into the water with a thud. And I was talking about this with a pastor friend, and he told me a story from his short-lived career as a schoolboy gymnast. After some rudimentary training in falling and tumbling, then they went to the vault. And they were shown how to run down the runway and jump off the trampoline, go through the air and land safely on the mat. And after a little bit of instruction, their instructor pulled a chair out, and he set it in front of the trampoline, and he sat down, and he held his arms up over his head like football goalposts. And he said, "Now run down, go off the trampoline, and dive through my arms, and land on the mat." So my friend and all his classmates did that. And then the instructor took out a sheet of newspaper, and he unfurled it above his head through the goalpost. And he said, "Now dive through the newspaper." Same trick, right? But now he's blocked their sight. So my friend ran down the runway, and shortly before the trampoline, he skidded to a halt and froze. "I couldn't do it," he said. "I could not do it because I could not see the landing." Seeing, in both its literal and figurative senses, takes on enormous importance in the Gospel of John. And let me pause here for just a moment. Aren't you glad we're talking about seeing today, not about bread? If you follow the last couple of Sundays, it's been all in the 6th chapter of John, not all about bread. And I sometimes suspect that the compilers of the lectionary were going through a famine, or at least a flour shortage, when they put together this section, because they really got stuck on bread. So today we're going to talk about seeing. In the famously poetic prologue to the Gospel of John, we read that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. And later in that same chapter, as Jesus is calling his disciples, what he says to them is, "Come and see." The fourth gospel, in fact, uses 5 different Greek words to describe seeing, looking, vision. Scholars disagree about the significance of this vocabulary. If you want to start a fight among New Testament scholars, this is a good one to do. Because some will say that each of the 5 has a very specific range of meaning, a very specific shade of meaning. And others will say, no, this is simply the gospel writer being a good stylist and using different words. After all, we have so many words in English for the act of sight. In either case, seeing in the Gospel of John implies a broad range of meanings, starting from the actual physical viewing, spotting something, catching sight of something, to observing, to noticing, beholding, we might say, and then a little more metaphorically, perceiving, or having insight into something. In the gospel, the drama around sight rises until we get to the 9th chapter, where Jesus restores sight to the man who was born blind. And sort of capping off his revelation of himself as the light of life and the light to the world. And when the Pharisees chide him for working on the Sabbath, he in turn turns to them and criticizes them for their spiritual blindness and lack of sight into the deeper meaning of things. So in today's passage, we heard Jesus say this: "Not that anyone has seen the Father, except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father." "40 years ago this month, I entered seminary. Among the mixture of complicated and sometimes contradictory motivations that led me into the academic study of theology and the arts of ministry, I was keenly aware that one strong motivation for me was my desire to see God. I had grown up hearing a lot of God talk, an awful lot of God talk. People around me spoke very confidently, or so it seemed, of God wanting this or wanting that, or telling them to do this or telling them to do the other thing, or God having a plan for their life or for my life. I found most of that God talk thin and hollow and unconvincing. Somehow what people heard from God seemed to correspond awfully neatly to what they really wanted to hear or were convinced they were going to do anyway. Forgive me if I was too skeptical, but that seemed to often be the case. I wanted to hear for myself. I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to encounter God. In his book, Naked Spirituality, A Life with God in 12 Simple Words, pastor and author Brian McLaren describes the struggle that I faced. He writes, "You may have come to the point where even the word God is problematic for you. You are so dreadfully sick and tired of hearing God's name overused and abused that you would rather not add to the commotion. You're tempted to compensate for all the noisy religious overstatement." I just love that phrase. The noisy religious overstatement. By speaking of God as seldom and as softly as possible. As you've been going through this painful process, of rethinking both your theology and your practice of faith. Your experience of God may gradually have been evaporating from your life. As a result, God may be shrinking from a substantial someone with a capital S to a vague something, leaving a thin residue that is next to nothing. All that may remain for you is a theoretical concept, an esoteric principle, a distant abstraction that's eventually not worth talking about or to. Does any of that sound familiar? Did you ever get sick and tired of hearing God's name overused and abused? But do you struggle to find acceptable alternatives? Does all that noisy religious overstatement pair up so badly with your own experience that it drives you sometimes to pained silence? For me, I found a way out when I read Vanderbilt theologian Sally McFay, who reminded me and reminds us that all of our language about God is really metaphorical. It's necessarily metaphorical or imaginative or symbolic, or McFay would say at times even playful. Because God is certainly not an object that we can measure and test and capture with our five senses and describe. God is a reality beyond our five senses. And McFay points out that much of our language, our ordinary language, is already metaphorical, so this shouldn't be such a surprise to us. And I've been sitting this morning in a chair that's held up off the ground by legs. And I've been resting my hands on the arms of the chair. But of course, if you could see that chair, those aren't really legs. What you walk on, those are legs. And those aren't really arms. They have no hands and wrists and elbows. Your arms are real arms. So that's metaphor. That's using what's familiar to describe the unfamiliar, or what's known to describe the unknown. These are ways of using language that is both not true, war is not a chess game, but also deeply true at the same time. And our theological language is perhaps the most metaphorical language of all. So when John's Gospel talks about seeing the Father, he's not talking about eyeballing Sig Westbrook on the sidewalk. We're hinting at, we're pointing to, we're alluding to something far deeper. We're using the tangible and the well-known to speak of what is intangible and less easy to know. God is fatherly, and God is not an old dude. God is motherly, and God is not trying to hold down the job of supervising virtual education for 2 grade schoolers. Or maybe God's trying to supervise virtual education for millions of grade schoolers. I don't know. That might be more accurate. So how do we do it? How do we see God, if not with our physical eyes? In his poem, Letter to a Bridge Made of Rope, Matthew Olsman gives us a hint through the metaphor of the bridge, of the rope bridge. He writes, "To the shepherd herding his flock through the gorge below, it must appear as if I walk on the sky. I feel that too. So little between me and the fall. But this is how faith works its craft. one foot set in front of the other, while the wind rattles the cage of the living, and the rocks down there cheer every wallow. Your threads keep this braided business almost intact, saying, don't worry, I've been here a long time. You'll make it across. So look for the skywalkers. And look for Jesus, the bridge that holds us up as we walk. Let yourself be awed by what you notice. Listen for what the threads of the rope say. And then walk boldly on the sky toward God. Don't worry. You'll make it across. And then you'll stick the landing.